Howdy, folks. Today we're going to be diving deep into developing your own artistic voice in landscape photography, finding inspiration, and creating truly meaningful images. Right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. As always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nuts, and before we get started, I've got one thing to ask of you. Over 65%, and I keep saying it is literally 65% still every week of our viewers on YouTube and listeners on audio are not actually subscribed to this channel. Come on, folks, let's change that. Just hit that subscribe button. It helps me get even cooler guests on the show. Just one click, that is all it takes. Thank you so much. Now, without further ado, let's welcome today's special guest, the internationally acclaimed landscape photographer, educator, adventurer, and master storyteller, the one and only Erin Babnik. Erin, good to see you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here.
Oh, fantastic. It's so great to have you on the show. Your photography is absolutely stunning. And since we're talking about developing your own artistic voice today, this is really something, I really feel when I look at your images, they are so like artistic. Um, was there a particular point in time, maybe a particular image or an event, um, when you first realized that you had your own personal style or voice?
Um, I won't say it's something like you wake up one day and you're like, "Hey, I've got a style. That's cool." And nor is style really static either. So it's not like something that you get it and then that you're done. You got your style now. We all know artists who had their early period, their middle period, their late period, that sort of thing. So style is for sure very dynamic and always evolving. But what does happen after you've been at it for a while, I think, is you reach a point where you have very strong ideas about what you want to do, what you like. Um, and you feel more compelled to pursue certain ideas and you feel like you have the solutions and it starts to feel a little bit more fluid. That said, there is also such a thing as just kind of plateauing and feeling a little bit stuck and like you're just kind of riffing off yourself and so there's two sides to that coin when you do have that kind of sort of that the strong vision for where you want to go. Sometimes it can be a little too strong and not necessarily helpful. But on the whole, I think it is a really good point to get to where you understand what it is that you like and how that differs from other decisions that you could make creatively. And that gives you something to work with and usually helps a lot in moments when the photography is more difficult and you have some go-to solutions, things that you like and that you can work with, not just because they're things that work all the time, for anybody. It's just when you have difficult decisions to make and you could do a number of things, what do you do? And when you get into that point where you just feel compelled, like you have a path, you kind of know it. There's a writer, I think his last name's Minkinen is how you pronounce it, and he wrote an article called "The Helsinki Bus Theory," I think it was called. I should have looked this up before we talked today so I could remember exactly, his name, but it's Minkinen, I think is the last name. But anyway, he basically described style as something like all the trains leaving Helsinki that are all kind of on the same path for a while, and then once they get out of town, they all kind of spread to their different routes. And style, being an artist, is like being on one of those routes, and for a while, you're kinda cruising along, and you don't notice any difference between your path and many others that you could be on, right? They all kinda look the same, you're not really clear how yours differs until you get out of town, right? And then there's a point at which is what he says, is that you look back and you're like, "Oh, hey, I was actually on my own train or my own bus all along." It's just that you don't see it for a while. And it really does take a while for you to get to where you understand what you like to do. And that really is all style is habit, and I didn't come up with that either. That's straight out of Art and Fear, the book by Bales and Orland. where they basically said, and I totally agree with this, that style is basically just habit. And the only way you're going to get habits is just by staying on that bus for a long time, right? The more you do stuff, the more you realize, oh yeah, I always kind of do that and I always kind of like it. Um,
So
yeah.
so
And
it's process in an
um
to a degree at least. I mean,
it is until it isn't. Excuse me.
because the thing is, like, for me as a portrait photographer, um, I control the environment for the most part in the studio. I control the lights, I control the modifiers, I control the subject to a degree. I control the background, the props, the costume, whatever it may be, and I can create something and shape something to my liking to a degree. And so I look at it through the lens of a portrait photographer, of course, because as I mentioned to you earlier, my landscape photography is absolutely shocking. And this is where I need your help to understand this, because in landscape photography, in my understanding, there are a lot. There are a lot of aspects that you can't control, or can you?
Oh, sure. You can't control the weather, you can't control conditions necessarily. You can kind of plan for them. But you can control where you go to begin with, and what sorts of environments you want to photograph, what sorts of situations you want to put yourself into, what sorts of gear you bring with you, what sorts of lenses, what focal lengths are even going to be on offer for you. It's not everyone who's going to haul around a lens that can hit 500 millimeters or one that can hit 10, right? So you're making decisions right off the bat just by putting the tools in your bag. Um, you also, of course, can make a lot of decisions in composition and then in technique with things you can do. Am I going to make a sun star or not? That sort of thing. Or processing, of course. That's the other half of it, really. So there certainly is a lot that you control, but you're right. There's a lot that you can't. But that doesn't mean that style is given to you or that your pictures are given to you. I don't believe that at all. We make them.
I really like your example of the trains sort of leaving the station or going in the same direction, and
That's maintenance.
make it, yeah.
He gets credit.
The interesting thing about that is that it is a matter of perspective, because if you're on a train and you're looking forward, of course you have one perspective, and your overall wide angle view only changes when you turn around and you look at where you came from. And I think that's a thing. Often when people start out in photography, there's so much to learn, controlling the camera, controlling the light. You tend to look forward. It takes maybe a while until you can actually turn around and realize, oh, I've come this far. Um, in order to then sort of realize that you've developed your own little style. Because I often use this example in music. So, for reference, I had a career as a session musician before I got dragged into photography. Uh, and the thing in music is that when you learn how to play an instrument, you basically copy a lot. You learn other people's songs, bits of guitar solos. You throw all of it in a pot. You mix it around. You do that for a decade or two, and the end result is gonna be uniquely you, but it is a product of all the different influences that you've thrown in over time. And because everybody's different and everybody's influences are somewhat different, the end result is always a different one.
I'm so glad you said that. Um, yeah, I definitely believe that you have to embrace the idea that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and there's no such thing as like a wholly original anything in art really anymore. So, yeah, everything that you're doing is basically sampling from this great collaborative experiment that is art that is always ongoing and putting some little spin on it because you've cut the cake your own way, right? And that's really the best that you can hope for. Is that you've taken those ingredients and you put them in there your own way and then you've kind of cut it your own way. That's your cake, right? So yeah, so I do fully believe that it's a good idea to look at other people's art. There's this, definitely some controversy among certain people who believe that it's a bad idea to look at other people's photography, or that you should somehow wall yourself off. Otherwise, you're just gonna slavishly copy everyone. And I strongly disagree with this notion, because all art is, as I said, a giant exercise of collaboration, of riffing off of what's come before and taking it in your own direction in a way that is never wholly new. And you also, we see so much on a daily basis that we can't unsee. And so it's much better to just feed the brain than try to starve it, and try, because then you can say that anything you came up with was all yours. I really feel that that's where that is coming from, is this deep desire to say, "No, I didn't just see it. That was me. It came completely from me." But if you just let go of that, and just to realize that the fun of it is actually that we're all kind of just sort of exploring the visual arts together, it's a lot healthier. A child from the age of whenever they can kind of open their eyes and process imagery is bombarded with it, especially in this day and age. 2D, 3D, that there have been studies done that the average very small child can now produce artwork that's much more sophisticated than adults could have done in Lascaux, or, in the cave painting era, right? Because they have seen and processed already by the age of 2, so much visual material that has been turned into two-dimensional form, or whatever. And so it's just, I don't think, a very healthy idea that, you should starve yourself of inspiration. And also, the whole thing with copying is you're choosing what you wanna copy, because why?
Yeah.
Because you liked it, right? And that tells you something about yourself. You liked that, right? I mean, it's different than if, you're on a commercial job and someone says, "I need something that looks like X." That's a little different. You still do learn something, though, at least from trying to ape the style of something where if maybe it's dictated to you, but we're talking about creativity and not so much the commercial process. But yeah, so, I really appreciate where you were going there with the idea of copying.
It's an interesting thing. So there's two things to unpick, or there's actually a number of things to unpick. But let's start with this. So the thing about commercial um, contracts, let's call them, is that I know from my own experience, very often I'm forced to do research into certain things because I have very specific client requests, and that of course helps me to grow and learn. You know, um, the reality is, I think in an ideal world, we'd all love it if you get a phone call and somebody goes like, "Oh, I want to hire you for your style because we love it. Please, enlighten us with your art." That virtually never happens. It's usually, in my case anyway, some company calls me up and goes like, "Oh, we need, promotional images for X. Can you do
Yeah.
it? And here is what our art department or what our, marketing department needs." And then it's like, "Sure, I can do it 100%." And then I'm like on the computer going, "How do you do this?" You know, and of course I have to do a degree of research in order to 100% match what the client wants, and what I need to deliver. That also means that I'm adding, ammunition to my own armory, whatever you want to call it. And the next time round, I have another tool that I can deploy.
So, talk that I did for years on composition included a bit where, I showed some old textbooks on landscape photography, the earliest one that I could find from the 19th century. And, they had such strict ideas about what worked and what didn't work, because at the time, all they knew was architectural photography, right? Back then, they had just graduated from the pinhole cameras, basically, where you needed a 10-hour exposure or whatever. And what they were photographing were things that didn't move. And so that tended to be city scenes with buildings in them, because buildings don't move. So you have all of these old photos where there are no people because the exposures were so long they couldn't pick up the people. And what they learned from that is that, wow, because architecture tends to be very symmetrical, and so do city streets for that matter, that it was possible to take a very static image. And so all these rules about composition were developed out of that era that just don't apply to the more organic forms that you find in nature. So you have in nature a delightful situation when you can find absolute symmetry, or when you can center something in a frame and make it work with the balance. That delights the eye, but this is more of an acquired vision, similar to what you're saying with people getting used to hearing more sounds in music. The more that we see how that works in nature, that, oh yeah, that actually can work really well. Not everything has to be counterbalance, especially in nature when there's just it's almost impossible to find absolute perfect symmetry in nature like you would in architecture. And so it's interesting that so much landscape photography plays on concepts of centering that had no place at all in photography books that treated the topic, in the 19th century. So very similar.
It's likewise, it's interesting, to see old textbooks in, portrait photography, for example, and the relative I mean, I'd say that very and I'm making broad sweeping statements here. The relative simplicity, compared to a lot of the, more contemporary portrait work that I see, which is actually why I love going to the portrait gallery, over here in London, because it's a fantastic, inspirational journey, through the centuries in terms of
Yeah.
paintings. And there's just two galleries here in London, the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery, which are fantastic. Um, I would say learning grounds for any portrait photographer, in terms of lighting and so on and so forth. Um, do you think that developing your own style is something that is inevitable, or is it something that needs to be even desirable for every photographer?
Well, let's just back up a minute and define what we mean by that. Recently published an article in Wild Eye magazine on exactly this topic. And in that, I said that it's important to make the distinction between what we mean by style and what we mean by stylization. And that often is what people mean when they say your own style or recognizable style. So style to me is not necessarily something that just is very superficial and easily picked up at first glance. Oh, that's got to be so and so. That's usually stylization. I mean, it's also a style, but it's because it's so stylized, you can easily just say, oh yeah. And it doesn't mean that someone who isn't doing very emphatic superficial effects doesn't have a style, right? Because they very much can. There is such a thing as a compositional style. You make certain decisions over and over again because you have those habits. And so I think that it is possible for someone to just continually experiment and never lock into something that they really like. So yes, to answer your question, I think it probably is possible that someone never really locks in. Sure, they're always wandering and experimenting, and if they're having fun with that, more power to them.
Yeah.
But it also means you don't really have that kind of guiding light, or that wonderful sense of just sort of self-knowledge that comes when you feel like you're doing something that feels like you, in a good way, not in a boring, "I've done this too many times" way. You know? So, yeah, but so style is it's that subset of possibilities that you really like and that work for you, and you feel like you're good at them, and they turn you on and you go looking for them, and then if you're looking for them, you stand a good chance of finding them, right?
And often I feel like often it's sort of, when you lock into something, I find this in portrait style, or stylistic, shoots that I do. I would lock into something for a while, for a good few years, maybe sometimes, and I like to really explore that particular thing. But then there may come a point where maybe through overexposure to it or whatever, you kind of go, I think I might like to explore something else because I've done that now. And then you sort of hop on to the next stepping stone. And so every time you do that, you take that knowledge that you've developed from the previous lock-in, so to say, and you take that with you and you grow, even more. I mean, I've certainly found that over time.
100%, 100%. Yeah, I mean, it's an evolution.
Yeah, evolution,
Yeah,
that's the word I was looking
there'll
for.
be certain things that you do, and you're like, "I don't think that's serving me well anymore." That was super fun to explore, and that was my go-to, and now I just am not feeling it. Like, that happens, and it should. I think that's a really good thing when you get to that point where you're like, "Okay, I'm turning a corner, I'm evolving, onward and upward." Otherwise it'll get really boring, and that's what happens, I think when people give up their art or give up photography is because like, they feel like they've learned it all, right? There are definitely people like that. They just feel like it's all about technique and learning a certain style, and once they've learned it, they've mastered it, it gets boring, and they go do, I don't know, underwater basket weaving or something, like, whatever it is the next thing.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platyball tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. Yeah, and I feel like I often use this sort of analogy. To me, photography is one of these disciplines or art forms that is, partially artistic, partially creative, partially technical. And to me, it's always, and I've used this a lot on this podcast. To me, it's like a spectrum. It's like a line, and you have the two extreme ends. Every photographer sits somewhere on that line, on that spectrum. Some people are super technical, but maybe have trouble with the creative side. Other people are super creative and don't necessarily worry about the technical too much. So I don't know. I would say in an ideal world, whatever, you'd probably want to be somewhere in the middle where you have total, grasp over the technical side, but are also super creative at the same time. That would probably be the sort of ideal
Yeah,
version
because
for
I
some
think
people.
what happens is, if you fall too far on the creative side, and I think I I lean that way myself, like, that's what fascinates me far more than the technical, although I love the technical too, but,
Yeah.
um and that was one of my ways into photography, and I think that's true for a lot of people, it's just like, "This thing is amazing, this little black box, like, what else can it do?"
Yeah.
Like, "How fun," But, as someone who's always been artistic, and I actually have a formal, education in the arts, definitely that was always there for me. But I think that people like me who just who are overly fascinated by the creative, you can get lost in it. It can you can, and this is so common. The the sort of troubled artist thing. Where you hate everything and you just you can't stop and just sort of get back to, like, that person who found the cool camera and was like, "Wow, this is fun, let's go play." You gotta remind yourself that play is such a huge part of it all, and if you're so caught up in your head, it can be really hard to get back to that part, just like, "Wow, this little," like, sometimes A new lens is, like, really what it takes, like, p there are a lot of I definitely was a snob for a while on that front, where I was just like, "I'm not gonna talk about gear. Don't ask me about gear," right? I'm above it. Now for the last, whatever, 6 years, I've been a Canon Explorer of Light, and I have all the gear I could ever want, right?
Yeah.
And you realize very quickly, once you're sort of your nose is rubbed in the gear again that like, "Yeah, I remember why I got into this because it's really fun and this stuff is cool and it's amazing," and it brings out certain avenues of creativity in and of itself, just because you're like, "Oh, it can do that? Hmm, well, that'd be kinda interesting to explore. Let's go see what I can do with that," you
Yeah,
know?
and it often is also just, this sort of, the kind of need to break the rules a little bit, I do this. So I did this in a talk only recently at a photography show where, I showed I demoed a particular portrait style, that I shoot a lot, which is kind of comical, caricature. It's hyper real, slightly weird and odd. And one of the things in that is that, I asked the audience, like, okay, in portrait photography, what would you say are the standard, focal length that you should use? And people come back with like, oh, 85, 100 mil, 70 to 200, that sort of thing. And I then go on to say like, well, everything I shoot today, I'll be shooting between 24 and 28 mil. Something that anybody and everybody would tell you not to do.
Yeah,
But I have a reason why I'm doing this because I want the lens distortion. This is part of
yeah.
what I'm trying to create here. So it's this thing about, shooting with intent. And I found this. I love to do street photography on the sides just because it takes me completely out of what I do on a day-to-day basis. Um, but I also like to challenge myself. And so I like to use lenses that you wouldn't ordinarily use for street photography, like, a super wide lens, for example. And then I like to limit myself in, well, this is the only lens I'm going to take today, you know? So I'm now forced to create something and I have to push myself and see how far I can take it with that. And that, again, that just, it almost like it forces you to think differently. And I think that is very often what then spawns a lot of creativity afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. I love what you said about focal length because I have a whole talk on that too, where I encourage people to go out and shoot 500 millimeter landscapes and also the super ultra wide, like 10 millimeters, 11 millimeters at full frame. Those are so fun because that's not how the eye sees things, right? And at the wide angle, absolutely because you're playing with the distortion, just like you said. It and you learn how you can make that work for you and what you can do with it. And if you're getting too hung up on, oh, I need everything to be what my eye saw, and some people take that so far. I know a very nice guy in Australia who one day said, it just occurred to me that maybe I don't need to agonize over whether or not the color of my leaves are exactly the same green as they actually were."
Yeah.
It's like, wow, you like that. I never wanted or cared
Yeah.
whether or not my green was a little too blue, because of like reality. Like, I care whether it's a little too blue for my color palette and my final result. I'll go crazy over that. But like whether or not I'm being faithful to nature, like I've never have felt like my job is to basically create something that's just a redundancy of like and at that it's just a travesty of what nature has produced, right? I can never really recreate it anyway. So
Yeah.
I'm not trying.
And, but, I can see that in your work because this is why I meant, at the beginning when I look at your landscape photography, there's something, sort of outer worldly about it. There's something hyper real to it that I find super fascinating, because
Well,
maybe I don't, maybe it's because I live in like, Southern England and, to me, this landscape isn't particularly inspiring. This is just because I'm used to living here, obviously. Um, but, when looking at your work, earlier we were talking about learning from other photographers and looking at other work and stuff. Were there any particular photographers or landscape photographers that inspired you early on?
Oh, so many. I mean, uh, it's almost kind of cliche to say Galen Rowell, but for sure. And it wasn't even really his landscape photography. It was his sense of the moment that I loved so much. There's a very famous image of his where I've heard 2 different stories about it, that it's actually him standing on a mountain peak with the sun aligned behind him, and his friend tripped the shutter, and it was his composition. I've heard the reverse, that it's actually his friend up there. Doesn't matter, it's a figure on a mountain peak at the very moment that the sun is behind the figure, and it's like this alignment, and like that before him, like, nobody had thought to do that, and, I've always loved mountains, and so those of us who did love mountains were just very taken by that, and I've never tried necessarily to put figures in my, images. It wasn't that necessarily, it's just this incredible sense of timing, and so that I got that out of him, but as far as, like, processing goes, I mean, I would be remiss not to mention, I think Mark Adamus deserves a mention there because, um, Mark took some things that were happening in other genres, especially of photography, and really just ran with them, and sort of pioneered some ideas that, I mean, some people were doing them, but not with the kind of determination that he was, such as focus stacking, for
Right.
example. Um, and that's a look that people weren't used to seeing in landscapes, right? Until they were. But, he was really, really pushing that. And to have that kind of that depth of field in a landscape when you could have something really small, super up close, such that you can really identify it and understand it, and you can also appreciate its context in a wide angle setting, was a different look, right? And so that very much falls on the processing, and it is kind of hyper realistic, right? We're not up to that point, we weren't used to seeing that sort of thing. So I was definitely, and I could go on. There are so many photographers who brought in ideas through post-processing, that allowed, um, people to see things in ways that no, it's not. It's not a documentary snap of what anybody with a camera could produce. It really does take some effort to bring that to your viewer. And, all of the people who did that, they inspired me.
And effort and artistic vision, because this is the thing. It's like you mentioned earlier. It's not a documentary style, so therefore you then expand whatever it is that you see with your artistic. If I haven't talked today, artistic vision. In post production, it's again. This is something I teach a lot in portrait photography. That I shoot for the edit. I already know how I'm going to post
Mm,
process it, and that will. Um, so almost dictate some decisions that I will make during the shooting stage because I already know what the post processing is going to be like.
totally, totally. I mean, and that's how I teach to this day. When we're out in the field, I'm with my group, I'm often saying, "Oh, this is going to be so much fun to process." And I'm trying to help them to see the possibilities there because a lot of times it really, does require an understanding of what's possible to even wanna shoot something. So often, I'll have students out there and they don't see it, they're not feeling it, then I'll show them a picture like, "This is the kind of thing that you're gonna end up with." They're like, "Oh," and then suddenly it just became really fun.
Yeah.
Like, it just opened a whole door of possibilities to them. I mean, and focus stacking is one of them. When they're looking and they're like, how do I make that work?" And then you're like, well, if it's all in focus, it does, I'm not saying that everything always needs to be a front to back focus, far from it. But, in certain situations where you have a difficult compositional, it's set of different difficult compositional options, it helps if you can get really close to something, exaggerate it in the frame through an ultra wide angle framing, which becomes possible, through focus stacking, right? So that sort of thing that it's people need to kind of see, oh, that's how close you were. That thing was that big. It's this little tiny flower, and it's got that presence in your frame. And once the world becomes your oyster. Once you realize that there are all these options, they do depend upon some chair time
Yeah.
when you get those files back. But if you're willing to do that, you've just opened up so much more to yourself that could be, really fun and rewarding.
Exactly, and it is exactly that literally hyper realism, that allows us to create things that we just can't ordinarily see just with the naked eye. Like focusing on things in a near, in the near foreground. Our eyes will automatically be out of focus as far as the background is
Yep.
concerned. And so, creating things that go against that, basically, to me, it always feels like it opens up another world, just like macro photography does. Like sometimes I look at macro photography and it sort of opens up a world that we just can't see. And yet it still
Yeah.
exists.
Yeah. That's a great
Um,
example, yeah.
Stuart Wood's macro photography, he specializes on photographic spiders, um, jumping spiders, I believe they're called. I know it's the weirdest subject, but when you look at his images, it's like it's like an alien world. It's like a totally alien world that we just cannot perceive just through the naked eye,
Yeah.
and yet it exists
Yeah.
because he's photographed it.
Yeah.
And so every time I see a spider now, I have newfound respect. Because it's like, "Oh, man, you guys are freakier than I thought you'd be." But, it's interesting because it really, it's sort of it's like an onion, and it peels back layers of the sort of perceivable world around us. And that's one of the most fascinating things about photography in general.
Yeah. I mean, the camera is a tool to see things, sure, as you always do, but also as you can never on your own. And, some people really embrace that. I'm one of them. I love playing with that. Being able to not only see things that are really small and close and putting them in context and that, like what we were just talking about, but also I love the super tele landscapes also. Be able to take something and frame it up in a way that can only be done when you're standing in this position and looking way over there, at 500 millimeters, that and the compression that you can get out of that and the way that you can bring something forward and really emphasize it in a way that you would probably most people would not even notice when they're standing there. That's super fun. It's always fun when I have a workshop and everyone afterwards is comparing their images, and people will say I hear this all the time, "Where were you when you took that?" And the person will be like, "Standing right next to you." You know?
Ah, yeah.
Like, the person, was right next to them and just saw something else because with 500, you've got so much out there that you could be looking at, and that guy just didn't see it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know?
and sometimes it is about, it's about the angle, it's about what's the word? Um, it's about application, I think. I always use this example. I've used it many times on this podcast. I remember a quick story. I went to when my wife and I went on honeymoon. We went to Canada and we went to Lake Louise, um,
Nice.
which was a beautiful place. And I was gonna do some photography around Lake Louise, and of course, by the time we got there, I was really hungry. And so, I walked up to the spot where everybody stands and takes the same shot, the shot that everybody's seen a million times on postcards and book covers and all the rest of it. And that's where everybody was. And then on the right-hand side is a hotel with a really good burger bar. And I was very hungry. And so, I'm just like, I look over and like, oh man, I could murder a burger right now. So I went up to the same spot as everybody else. I took that shot and then I went for dinner. And that was it. And of course, when I got home, I'm like, oh man, what a missed opportunity. This teaches me two things. First of all, make an effort. Make an effort to step somewhere else, get a different angle, try different things, think about it, but also never go shooting hungry. So that's
Yes.
one thing I've learned for myself.
I would have done that too. I would have done exactly what you did because, yeah, I get like that. I get ravenous sometimes, and, like, if I am, that wins.
Yeah.
It does.
How much preparation goes into into your images. This is the thing that fascinates me the most about landscape photographers. Is it like where's that sort of balance between spontaneity and preparation?
Oh, it's for me rotating, you know. I love doing it both ways, you know, the gathering and the hunting. So sometimes, and it usually starts with just I want to explore. That's my go-to, you know. I always say that um, that is your way into discovering yourself. The more that you find to photograph, the more that you find yourself. And I love going out and just seeing what I might find in places where I'm not necessarily supposed to find anything. I don't know what I'm going to find. I haven't seen any photos of that place. I don't even know if it's going to be photogenic. But if there's something about it that makes me, I don't know, curious or feel like exploring it, I go. And that means that sometimes I come home empty handed, or I come home just with an idea, and now it's a hunt, right? Now I gotta figure out how to make that idea work, like, that okay, that place at this time, no, but now I know when I'm gonna come back and the kind of, conditions I'm gonna try to get here, and that can work out really well. Just kinda go out and explore and say, "What is it about this place that turns me on? Why I'm even here?" And just sort of let yourself enjoy that, right? And then turn it into the hunt at some point. So that's how I find the balance for me is that I allow myself to come home empty-handed a lot, actually. I'm okay with that.
Is there like a when you go out on the gathering part of it, as you described it, is there like a particular do you have particular habits that you or is it like a particular sort of procedure that you follow?
Definitely moving around a lot. So it's always exploration is the beginning of that, always. Like if of course, if I see something that's great and really grabs me, I'll start playing with it. But ordinarily, I'll see something like, "Oh, that's kinda cool, and I wonder what's over there." Like, I just get really curious, and I run around a lot, and I just explore and kind of check things out, and that usually means moving my feet a lot. I love hiking, and I'm totally fine with just going further and just seeing what's around that next corner, you know? Um, but once I do kind of lock onto something and I'm attracted to it, um that's the point at where style starts to kick in, and usually there's just, at this point, less experimentation at that point. I usually know what I wanna do with it. Then that's where the habits come in. I know which lens I'm getting, and I have an idea, and sometimes it doesn't work, and I have to back off and actually be analytical about it. But I think that's when you've been at it for a while, your your impulse is kinda there for you, and you don't have to think about it consciously too much, and then you just kinda get in there and you know what you like, and you're gonna go for that, and if it doesn't work, then you kinda sit back, you're like, "Why didn't that work? I still like it. How can I make this work?" And then it gets analytical.
And I mean, often that's the fun, the problem solving part is often the fun. Like, how can I make this happen?
Yeah.
When you have the idea, like I talk from a portrait photography point of view, often I have an idea, and then I sort of, I backwards engineer it or I reverse engineer the idea in order to figure out, well, how am I gonna do this? Like, what's the lighting gonna be like? What's the modifier? What blah 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 blah. All the technical stuff, and I just try to figure out how to make this happen. Um, do you use any specific tools? I'm thinking a friend of mine introduced me to an app called PhotoPills the other day, which I
Mhm.
thought must be useful in some way.
Yeah, PhotoPills is wonderful. I'm friends with those guys, and they've, brought me in on projects and stuff before. That's an incredible resource, super helpful. Absolutely, I use it, mostly for me for the planning feature. I wanna know where the sun's going to be, but it's a go-to, absolutely. For astrophotographers, it's indispensable because there's so much in there that can help them, with alignments and timing. But As far as, like, other apps go, they're mostly, uh, 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 they mostly have to do with weather and conditions. I'd say that's I have a ton of those sorts of apps because when I am in that hunting mode, when I know what I want, um, then it's all about how can I get it, and I will spend a lot of time just studying cloud height and openings and just trying to get myself in there. And sometimes, I'll be on a project or something and I have to deliver, right? So then
Yeah.
it might be like, all right, long drive because the clouds are over there. And I need them for what I'm doing. So let's go do that. Yeah. But other times, when you're like, no clouds here. Okay, we're not using the sky today. We're gonna do small scenes. Let's
Yeah.
go look for those.
That to me, it's always been one of the most fascinating aspects. The whole like the sort of data point checking. When it comes to like meteorological data, for example. I spent some time in Arctic Norway a year and a bit ago with Dave Williams, who you know is like the master of Northern Lights photography. And, I never really considered how dependent, of course, that is on the weather. Because if you got clouds, well, you can't see anything. So one of his like mega superpowers is he's really able to compute all these different data sets in order to figure out exactly where you need to be at what time, and also on which side of the mountain you've got to be. Because if you're on the wrong side of the mountain,
Yeah.
you don't really see anything.
Right.
Um, so that I found that extremely fascinating and unbelievable, um, as to what kind of results we got at the time in comparison to lots of other people who kept complaining that they spend like, I spent 2 weeks in Northern Norway, never see the Northern Lights. It's like, oh, funny, we've been out there every night. So it just goes to show, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, like, I've had people say, "Oh, good light just follows you around." Like, "No, I follow it around." Like, it's it's a lot of work sometimes.
Do you do you actively push yourself outside of your comfort zone?
Oh, yeah, for sure. To a fault almost, I'd say. And that's why, like I was saying, sometimes I come home empty-handed. I try things that just totally fail. Like just stupid ideas sometimes. I remember one time I was in England, I was speaking at the, on landscape conference there, and afterwards, the organizer brought a bunch of us out to some of his favorite spots, and there was this one that was like I don't remember what it was called, but it was a cave on the edge of some woods, and, there was water cascading down off the front of the cave, and it wasn't enough to sort of register in the frame, but it was really interesting to me, and so I'm like, "What if I just were to, like, get underneath it and let it hit the lens and, like, get it all over the camera?"
Yeah.
I literally tried that. I'm lucky it didn't kill the camera, but it looked terrible and it totally didn't work, but, I don't know, you find out the hard way sometimes why some things are just terrible ideas, but
Well,
yeah.
that's it. Yeah, but that's I mean, that's a little bit like, like small children. They just, sometimes they just have to basically
That's
take the
it.
most episode.
I think you have to have that attitude as a landscape photographer some of the time. You have to just be a little toddler out there trying things because sometimes it does work out, and you come up with something that is a little crazy, but it works, and it was fun and it actually worked and now you've got something. Like I remember one of my kind of recent shots that I just really enjoy. I decided one day I was just going to throw a portrait lens in the bag, an 85 millimeter f1.2 lens, Canon's RF 85 1.2, which by no measure, by anyone's definition, is a landscape lens, right? That like, nobody's going to say, yeah, you need that one for landscape. But I decided I would just see what I could do with it, and decided when I would just like totally waste a really interesting evening of clouds, and I saw some wide angle stuff that I could have been doing, but I had this lens in the bag, and I thought, "I'll just give this a shot," and I was around a bunch of Joshua trees, and I just kinda shot right down the throat of a Joshua tree, wide open, and, I felt like a little kid in a candy store. It was so cool. It was just this, like, mandala effect and, like, where everything was, like, sharp at the center and then went way out of focus and near the lens, like, all the way around. And it was absolutely mesmerizing to me, and I still love the photo. So, gave up a landscape for it, a wide angle, but, that was fun, and it required me just to be a sort of a stubborn little kid who wanted to play with that toy.
But that's the thing. It's like not being afraid to fail. I think it's the
Yeah,
it's the thing.
that way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah. So and again, like experimenting with with lenses, that are not necessarily meant in inverted commas for this particular purpose. It'll just help you push your creativity, outside of your comfort zone, and then hopefully lead to something that you wouldn't have been able to imagine beforehand. This is the thing that I always
Exactly,
like.
exactly, and I actually, that reminds me of something I often say to students is when we're out in difficult conditions, and it's usually because it's like bluebird, there's not no clouds out there. They're not getting, epic, what they call Erin skies. They're not getting what they saw in my photos of that place. And so it's hard, right? And so I'll often just say, well, there's a lot you could be photographing out here, but you need to go find it. And so you have to ask yourself, do you want to take a photo today? Because if you do, the first thing you have to do is just get out there and start playing. And once you start playing, you'll kind of get curious about something. That curiosity will lead to an idea. The idea will lead to kind of an obsession. And then that will lead to a photograph that you never knew you were going to take going into this. And it's totally yours. Right. So that's like the best advice I can give anybody when the going gets tough is just to play with it and just I don't know. Worst case scenario, you get nothing, right? Which you already probably think you're getting. So why not
Yeah.
just play with it?
Well, that's the thing, and I always think like it's. I mean, it's not the end of the world. It's like we're not.
Yeah.
I don't know. We're not curing cancer or anything here.
We're just taking
We're
pictures.
just taking
Yeah.
pictures. Yeah, exactly. That's always the thing.
Exactly.
It's like I know some people beat themselves up, and I always think
Yeah.
like, man, it's not. Come on, let's just have I
Yeah.
don't know a cinnamon bun and some coffee. That's all good. Even if that's all we got from today's trip,
Oh, we
we're
got that
still all
coffee.
happy. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And of course, I remember that workshop I did with Dave Williams up in the Lofoten Islands. It was an interesting thing because when you do something like hunting the aurora, well, there is a very realistic chance that you might not actually get to see it in the time that you're there because of
Yeah.
weather conditions and everything else.
Yeah.
Um, but the idea was that we because you're in such an amazing landscape, there's always something else to shoot. If if the aurora is laying it down, well, there's amazing landscape photography to be had there. And we had some Viking models with us for the whole time. So my part in it was I was teaching on location lighting. Um,
Oh,
so
cool.
so we had basically we always had like lighting gear and two models with us for the whole time. So if there wasn't an aurora, well, there'd be an amazing
You could
landscape,
do that.
and we just do that exactly. So and that was the thing, and this is also where I realized that I totally suck at landscape photography, by the way.
Well, I'll just have to take your word for it because I haven't seen your work, to be
Oh,
honest, but
nobody's seen my work.
but I bet you're being hard on yourself.
No, no, no. Well, so if I'm honest, I've learned a lot. Um, I have learned what not to do, and that's often the best sort of lesson. I know what doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it's the Sherlock Holmes thing, isn't it? Is you eliminate everything that doesn't work, and what's left over must be the thing that works, or something along those lines. That's what I'm on my journey to doing that. But it's also it's taught me a number of things. It's also taught me, that on this occasion, because I'll be going back there in a couple of weeks, it's taught me that on this occasion, I want to do some long exposure photography, and I want to look into some filters, like ND filters and stuff, which is why I thought it's the perfect opportunity to ask you for some advice when it comes to that.
All right.
So, yeah, so this is the idea. I want to experiment with some long exposure photography. Um, And I hear the ND filters are the way to go. So imagine somebody who's a complete novice in this sort of field, which I'm sure some of our listeners are, and me included. What would your advice be when it comes to long exposure landscape photography?
Oh, I'd say it's pretty standard. Something's gotta be moving, okay?
Yeah.
Or it cannot look like it's moving, but you wanna get some color, like, out of the sky, and sometimes, like, it's sunset, and the clouds are kinda thick, and they're not really moving that fast, but they are moving, and sometimes a long exposure could just bring out some more color, and that can be interesting. But if you wanna, smooth out water, obviously, or make the clouds show the direction that they're moving. Often it helps if they're moving towards you or away from you and not across the frame because it looks more dynamic. You get those lines that are, showing off depth, like leading lines, right? Rather
Yeah.
than just going across. But across can look cool too. I have some that really just depends. I would recommend a 10 stop usually, at least, because you get a good long, unless you have something moving real fast, really fast moving clouds, you might maybe a 6 stop might work. But yeah, I think that's all pretty standard advice. But yeah,
Yeah.
long exposures are super fun.
Yeah, so that's my intention anyway. So because the opportunity is there, you've got the sea, you've got fjords, you've got clouds, most likely, stuff like that. So that would be cool and incredible landscapes. Highly recommended.
Yeah,
It's
for sure.
it's pretty
Yeah,
nuts.
I actually haven't been there, but yeah, I would love to go someday. I will.
Yeah, yeah, it's incredible. It's this the thing that fascinated me about it was that you're really at the edge of civilization. Like literally,
Yeah,
there's the line. You take one step across that line, and you're in the wildest wilderness you could possibly imagine. Under incredibly harsh conditions.
yeah,
I remember it's a funny thing. I think I've mentioned this before, but basically, there's a small. What they call it, the capital. It's not a capital. It's like a village, basically. Um, but there's a shopping mall there, and it has 6 shops in it, one of which is a cafe. And the interesting thing about that is that you sit in that cafe, and it's a modern cafe, like, just like a cafe. I mean, you could think you're in London, you're in, I don't know, Manchester, you're in New York, wherever, right? It's totally modern, stylized, it has all the fancy, in inverted commas, coffees you could possibly imagine, all the baked goods you can imagine, the, I don't know, almond croissants and this and that and the other. Then you take one step outside and you realize that the next thing's the North Pole.
yeah.
Quite literally. And it's just bizarre.
That's
Um,
cool.
but
Yeah.
for that reason,
Have you ever been to Antarctica?
no, so I've been to the Arctic, I haven't been the other way.
Okay, yeah, because, there's a post office there, you may know about it. So it's like the one thing
Uh-huh.
that the cruise ships always take people to, but it's a similar kind of feeling where, like, you're literally in the wildest place in the world, and then you're shopping in a post office, so yeah, they have a gift shop there, and, like, it's bizarre.
Did you have any situations where, like, really nothing worked out and it was a total disaster?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I've how many horror stories do you have time for? I'm full of them. I've got one a million times I almost got killed or someone else did or, you know,
Really?
um,
You almost got killed?
oh my god, the worst for me, well, there were just several that come to mind now, but, one time I was, in the Dolomites and I was, on a via ferrata and had an old map and, I didn't realize that the part that I was going on was actually a via ferrata. That's you should be equipped for these, right? You don't just hike that. Like, you should be clipped in and have,
Oh,
a
yeah.
harness and everything. And I was doing it backwards. So, had I had a newer map that was correct, I would have known that I was going backwards the way that you should only, um, ascend, not descend, and it was super dangerous to descend from that side, and, and I started in one end and I got through this one super hairy part and I thought, whoa, I am no way am I going back. Like, this is crazy. I want off of this, but I'm not going back through that. So I'm going to keep going. And this just kept going like this. And every time I would get through some super crazy gnarly thing, it was like, now I'm 2 or 3 super crazy gnarly things from where I started. So I guess I have to keep going, right? So it's like a cat getting stuck in a tree, you know?
Yeah.
And, I, uh, I eventually got to this point where I was exhausted. I was physically exhausted. I no longer had any upper arm strength. It's a lot of using your arms through this whole thing. And, I was with my husband at the time, and he is 6 feet tall and quite a bit taller than I am. And so he was able to get down this one part that I could not, and I got stuck, and I was too short to reach the next rung, and it's a rung where you're supposed to be going up, not coming down, right? So, um, I was all I had was, either fall, which was I was about 1,000 there was about 1,000 feet of exposure there. It was just death, total death to one side, and the only way up was to lift myself up with my completely exhausted arms. And that's the closest I've ever come to death when it started snowing at that very moment. I'm like, "Oh, awesome." Like, like I'm
Perfect
already
timing.
feeling like I'm dead. Now it's freaking snowing on me. Like, it was so scary. And I just screamed like weightlifters do when they're trying to lift up, or like climbers do. I'm like, "Ah, like this has got to help, right?" I see them do this, and it actually did. And I had a full pack on, like, huge pack on, with like a 70-liter pack or 60-liter pack with a full size tripod and everything, and it was just insane. But I just finally get myself up there, and when I get up back up, because I couldn't go down, couldn't finish the route. The only thing I could do was go back through all of that stuff, the super crazy, hairy stuff that I'd said, "No way, I'm not going back that way." That was my only way back. I couldn't make it down. So, I spent the next 3 hours doing the whole route in reverse. So, yeah, that was, uh, very, very scary. So, I've had a lot of didn't take hardly any photos. I did, like, in the first, like, part of it, like, when I was about a third of the way through, and it was still not clear to me that I was completely in danger. So, yeah.
I was gonna say, did you get the shot at least?
I got some shots, but it wasn't what I thought I was going for. So there was another mountain in a different direction that I thought I was gonna have a good angle on, and I'll never take that photo. It's fine. I'm good.
It's probably not worth the risk, maybe, that's the thing.
No.
Um, when you look back at some of your earlier work, do you sometimes look at earlier work and go like with with your experience now of what you know now, do you sometimes look back at earlier work and go, "Oh man, I wish I had done this," or "I want to do that again." Does that happen? Or
To be honest, there was a period when I could say absolutely yes to that, and now that I'm a million years old, I actually look back at some of my work, I'm like, "Damn, I was way better back then." Like, that was the how come I can't do that anymore? So, I don't know. Sometimes that's how I feel, that it's, going downhill, but then I'll, suddenly have a good day and all is forgiven, but and I remember having a professor, I was an academic in art history before I was a full-time photographer, and I remember him saying that to me about his writing. He was saying that at one point, I remember him saying that he looked back at his juvenilia and thought, "I was good back then. Like, I can't write like that anymore." So I don't know if you're just being too hard on yourself or if that's true. It could just be true. You peak and then I don't know.
well,
But I
I mean,
definitely feel that way.
it's sometimes I think it's when you look back. I mean, I look back at some stuff that I did like I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, and I think like, wow, there was almost like a childlike playfulness in some of it, which for one reason or another, I feel like maybe I don't know, maybe I gotten older. Well, I did get older. but maybe I got more, I don't know, more cynical, and I've just lost that sort of willingness to experiment sometimes, maybe, and that's how I
Yeah,
prefer to look at it.
and I think also for me, and it's kinda related to that, just having youth means just you are so determined, and you work so hard when you're first starting out. Everything's on the line. It's so important to you. You have so much energy and you want it so bad. I think I worked I know I worked really, really hard and I still work hard, but maybe not as hard. Maybe that's it. I don't know.
But that's the thing. I mean, at least you've gained all the experience. That's the thing, and of course, you're now in a position where you can pass that on, which you do through your workshops.
I do. Yeah. And so, maybe I'm not s- you know, just I it is in landscape photography, very physically demanding, And so you can only for so long shoot every single sunrise and every single sunset and hike 8 hours a day up 3,000 feet of elevation gain. All that crazy stuff that I used to do. I'm not at that level of crazy anymore. And maybe that's what makes the difference. You got to be at a pretty high level of crazy. You
Yeah.
know?
Um. Tell me a little bit about your workshops because you're running workshops fairly
Yeah,
regularly.
I'm on hiatus this year. Aside from no, that's next year. Got another Antarctica one coming up with Justin Black in January. But mostly I do adventure style workshops. So I will take people out into places where they're not going to see other photographers. And I find ways to get them there so that most people can do it. I used to do really crazy backpacking workshops that were pretty demanding, and I increasingly made them easier. Found ways to get people or at least convey their gear so they didn't have to hike with it and that sort of thing. But Dolomites, French Alps, I've done, Iceland, all over the Southwest, wherever Death Valley, tons of Death Valley. Um, so what they all tend to have in common is that they are wilderness areas that are either mountainous or desert for the most part, or some version of that where things are changing a lot. And you can go to a variety of places and not feel like you're being haunted by the ghosts of a thousand other photographers who've come before you, where you can be creative and where because things are changing so much, they're very dynamic. Like the Dolomites, for example. Okay, the peaks don't change that much, but the atmosphere, 100%, like, can just completely conceal and reveal whole mountains, and, I have photos that most people don't even know where I was standing or what that is, because the atmosphere is so thick, and that's what I love about that area. And then the desert, the literal ground changes, like areas with, like, mud tiles or whatever, for example, might be there one season and then gone the next, and, so I tend to really enjoy those areas where I can get people out there, and we're all doing a little bit of, like, exploring, just to see how things have changed since even the last week.
Yeah. That's actually one of the things I love about the Lofoten Islands is that the environment is always changing and it's so radically different. There's snow there for about, I don't know, 9 months of the year, which is great. But then the 3 or 4 months where there's no snow, it turns into a completely different landscape because now nothing's covered in white. It's you got this Arctic tundra mosses, these greens and browns, and ochre type colors, and that's offset against the blue sea and the black granite mountains, and it's like a different place. If you're there in October, which when I was there, it's so different from what it looks like in February when it's like full on
Yeah.
mega snowstorms and everything. Um, have you have you noticed changes in the environment more general, like let's say the impacts of climate change or something like that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I used to do winter Dolomites workshops every year. I used to do a lot of them. And, anymore, I can't even peg when we might have snow, it's just so hard. And likewise, another thing, just to use dolomites again, with wildflowers. It used to be so predictable. I knew roughly, like within a week or two, what varieties of wildflowers would be growing in a certain place, and I could pretty much count on, all right, they might be peaking next week or the week before, but at least I know they'll be here, and I just need to find the patch that's still peaking, right? Um, and it got to the point where the landscape just seemed utterly confused, and all of the wildflowers were growing all in this compressed period all at once and then gone. It was, so I would come with one group and it was like, "Wow, I've never seen those varieties of flowers growing side by side. That's bizarre." Wonderful for that group, and then the next group has nothing, like no flowers. you know? So, that got weird. Yeah.
The interesting thing about this is that it sort of comes full circle. So now your landscape photography actually turns into, I was like, documentary photography since the environment keeps changing.
In a way, yeah, I mean, I remember, again, like glaciers, little glaciers that I used to be able to go to, and I knew there would be runoff from that, and now they're gone, in the mountains and French Alps too. Yeah, so and now I have photographs of these things that are never coming back. Um, so yeah, in a sense, there is that documentary side of things, which isn't really what turns me on and what motivates me. Because like I said, I feel like at best I'm creating a souvenir or some kind of, redundancy, like, like I'm not trying to like just I capture nature. I who that You're not capturing nature. Okay, you're just not. Like nature is this wonderful thing that you just have to go and experience. You can't capture it. But what you can do is tell stories. And so that's what I like to do, with my photographs. But there is for sure that element of your camera's picking up those photons, and that stuff was there at that time. And I do appreciate that to some extent. So yeah,
And of
that I
course, it
have those.
inspires others. That's the other thing. It literally, showcases a particular area the way that it was at the time. So in that sense, it is inspiring,
Yeah.
from an artistic point of view, but also again from a maybe from an ecological or environmental point of view, just the
Yeah.
same. So that to me is always that's the interesting part about that. Uh, you know, so where can people find your work?
The best place really anymore, to be honest, like right now, because I have a lot going on right now. I've been posting most of my new work to Canon's channels, Canon USA's channels. So they've got the new stuff, but I am totally revamping my website, which I have been doing for a long time. And at the same time as I've been renovating here, as we discussed earlier. So a lot going on. But my website would be the next place
Go on.
to, to find the work. And then like social media of my own channels, that's the last to get updated, honestly. Some people put that first, but I just don't.
And of course, all the links will be in the description. Either if you're listening on audio, it'll be in the description of the podcast episode, or if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll find it. You'll find all the links in the description below, of course. Erin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, an absolute education, and I will make you a promise. I'll work on my landscape photography, and I'll see where I get to with that. So
Well, I look forward to seeing where it goes. And thank you so much for a delightful conversation. You're very good at this.
all right, folks, that's a wrap for today's episode. It was awesome having Erin on the show. But before we go, let me just recommend another episode that I think you'll like. Check out episode 187 with Russell Preston Brown. I'm sure you love it. If you enjoy this content, consider supporting us on buymeacoffee.com/camera shake to help us keep bringing you more amazing episodes. It really does mean the world to us. And for those of you listening on audio, did you know that there's a video version of this podcast over on YouTube? Well, you should by now because I keep mentioning it all the time. You get to see our guest's stunning photography in full Technicolor over there. So just head over to YouTube, search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you can watch all of our past episodes there as well. And if you're already there, be sure to drop us a comment, hit the like button, ring the bell, and share with your friends. Your engagement helps us reach even more people across the globe. So thanks again for listening and watching. Remember, a new episode drops every Thursday, so make sure you mark that in your calendars, diaries, whatever you kids use these days. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography. See you next Thursday.